A piece of valuable real estate along the Oregon coastline is sold at auction to developers. They call it Whale Cove. But at least one man is fighting to preserve Whale Cove as an historic landmark. For it was here, says Bob Ward, that the British Empire began.
Drake's New Albion was the birthplace and first outpost of the British Empire, and itself is a most historic place. It's probably one of the most historic sites in North America and of international importance.
For nearly 50 years, historians believed that Drake's North American landing site, which he called New Albion, was in California at the small estuary known as Drake's Estero near San Francisco. But new analysis of some very old evidence has brought that into serious question and thrown open the doors to other theories about Drake's Landing.
There's 14 sites, I think, at least, along the California and Oregon coastline, which has been put forward where Drake is supposed to have sojourned during July and August of 1579.
The confusion stems from over 400 years of secrecy surrounding Drake's famous voyage around the world, initially imposed by England's Virgin Queen, Elizabeth I. England in the 16th century is an economic backwater. Spain and Portugal are the superpowers who enjoy the spoils of a world divided between them by the Pope. Elizabeth tries desperately to expand Britain's trading in the New World to pay off ravenous debts. And her plan is to do it under the very noses of the Spanish.
She had to run this very fine balance between managing to improve the economics of England and balance that against the threats that were constantly there from Spain and Portugal.
It is into this world of political intrigue that a commoner named Francis Drake comes of age. Born around 1542 to a tenant farmer and strict Protestant lay preacher, young Francis would soon find his calling at sea.
Drake began as a young man in the coastal trade of simply local, perhaps going across the channel to Holland, whatnot, and he was quite successful with that as a young man. And he had the good fortune to be connected to the Hawkins family.
Drake's cousin, John Hawkins, runs a successful trading business out of Plymouth Harbor with a fleet of sturdy ships. In the 1560s, Francis Drake joins Hawkins on a series of voyages to the Guinea coast of West Africa, where they take on highly valuable cargo: African slaves.
Spain had a monopoly on the trade of slaves, and it was forbidden by the king for anyone else to come and trade slaves there, so this was an outlaw activity.
But slave trading is not the only illegal activity Hawkins has in mind.
The English merchant marine was basically under orders of the Queen to go out and disrupt Spanish shipping.
The fleet would then continue on across the Atlantic to the West Indies and the coast of South America. But the Spanish ports of the New World are technically off-limits to English ships.
King Philip had prohibited all interlopers at port facilities, but it was a different reception for the struggling colonists. They wanted the trade. Often the Spanish governors turned a blind eye to the king's orders.
Slaves and trade goods are sold for considerable profit. Still, delicate negotiations are required to trade in the Caribbean. To keep up appearances, Hawkins and his crew must stage seaborne assaults on some of the coastal ports.
Mock attacks were actually set up by John Hawkins so that the governor could write to the king saying that we were forced to trade under the threat of extreme violence.
These voyages are an ideal training ground for a young pirate. But Drake's next voyage with Hawkins would provide a painful lesson in Spanish duplicity. In 1568, while off the coast of Cuba, Hawkins' fleet is severely damaged by a hurricane. Hawkins, with Drake now serving as captain of one of the ships, orders the fleet to put in for repairs at San Juan de Ulua on the east coast of Mexico. But their timing is terrible.
The colonists allowed Hawkins in to use port facilities to repair, but unfortunately the incoming Spanish viceroy was due any day.
When the royal fleet arrives, Hawkins and Drake find themselves surrounded by Spanish warships. Unprepared for a fight, the Spanish negotiate an uneasy truce. But the Spanish viceroy has no intention of keeping his word. 2 days later, the Spanish attack.
The viceroy broke his word because he thought he didn't have to keep his promise to heretics, and a lot of the English were killed.
Hawkins and Drake escape in 2 small ships and limp back to England on the westerly winds. For Hawkins, the voyage is a financial disaster and marks an end to his raiding days. But for Drake, it is just the beginning.
Drake used that experience of treachery to reap revenge on the Spaniards for the rest of his life.
In 1572, Drake returns to the Caribbean in command of 2 small ships seeking retribution. His target? The small town of Nombre de Dios on the north coast of Panama.
The importance of Nombre de Dios was that it was the Atlantic terminal at the Isthmus of Panama for all of the gold and treasure that Spain was taking off of the Pacific coast of the Americas.
Once a year, the accumulated wealth of Spain's mining colonies in Chile and Peru is brought north by ship to the Isthmus of Panama. There it is transported overland by mule trains to the port of Nombre de Dios on the Atlantic side, where tons of gold and silver are loaded onto Spanish galleons for the trip to Spain. This is the famous Spanish Main.
Drake apparently figured out that he would go to the Spanish Main in Panama and personally capture the silver, either on the mule train or from the storehouses, Nombre de Dios.
Drake ambushes the annual mule train 1 mile inland from Nombre de Dios. There is so much gold and silver that the small band of Englishmen cannot carry it all back to their ships. Still, Drake and his crew sail back to England with ample plunder.
News of his arrival, Whitsunday in 1573, actually caused the service at St Andrew's Church to disintegrate as the parishioners left their pews one by one when they heard that Drake's ship had returned full of treasure.
Though now a wealthy man, Drake is restless and yearns to return to the New World. For while he was on the Isthmus of Panama, Drake had caught a glimpse of his future from a tall tree.
When they climbed up the tree, they could actually see both the Atlantic and the Pacific at the same time.
Seeing the blue Pacific, Drake vowed to be the first Englishman to sail on it. When we return, Drake finds himself in command of the most important and secretive mission in England's history.
His crew was sworn to secrecy under pain of death if they revealed details of their movements.
In 1576, Drake, a commoner, receives a most unusual summons. Queen Elizabeth I wants to meet with him.
It was an interview conducted in secrecy because even the guards were asked to leave the room.
According to a later account, the Queen declares her intent for revenge on her mortal enemy, Philip II, in Spain's New World colonies. A plan is quickly proposed, a voyage so audacious it just might work. With the deal struck, Elizabeth swears should any man leak word of their plans to Philip, she will have his head. Other than Drake and the Queen, only a few know the true nature of the voyage. Some include Lord Walsingham, the Queen's Secretary of State, Sir Christopher Hatton, Captain of the Queen's Bodyguard, the Earl of Leicester, a favorite of the Queen's, and John Hawkins, Navy Treasurer.
Well, these are people who were in Queen Elizabeth's council. They were her counselors. They were wealthy people, people who had knighthood. They were leading people in the English government.
But these men are also investors in the voyage, hoping for a fat return on their shares.
The Queen in particular had to maintain a distance, and so while they were busy putting money in, and that is recorded, they were also taking pains to try and keep at arm's lengths.
As Drake assembles his fleet, officers and crew are recruited on the basis that the voyage is a trading voyage to Alexandria on the Mediterranean coast of Egypt.
That held fairly well because from the Spanish records, there isn't really anything that indicates that they thought, that the Spanish thought otherwise.
In fact, the voyage does have several unofficial objectives other than raiding Spanish ships.
What they were hoping is that they could find a sea route around the northern continent of America. And that was the mythical Northwest Passage, or what they called at the time the Straits of Anians.
England desperately needed to find its own trading routes to China and the East Indies, where spices and so on were now becoming commodities that needed to be acquired. And the conventional routes to those countries were already blocked and controlled by Portugal and Spain.
In December of 1577, Drake's fleet of 5 small ships set sail from Plymouth with a crew of approximately 164 sailors. Drake's flagship, the Pelican, is his largest command so far. Constructed to Drake's specifications, she represents the pinnacle of British shipbuilding technology. The other ships, the Elizabeth, Swan, Marigold, and Benedict, are all smaller vessels, captained by friends and relatives of Drake and other investors. But to the surprise of nearly everybody aboard, instead of sailing to the Mediterranean, Drake steers the fleet south for the open Atlantic.
Once the ships passed the latitude of the Strait of Gibraltar, they knew that they weren't going to Egypt. Imagine telling your wife you're going to be home in a few months' time, when in fact you're going to be away for 2 years, 10 months.
Grumbling among the crew grows daily, making for a difficult crossing. Drake soon discovers that his friend, Thomas Doughty, a nobleman, is encouraging the discontent.
Doughty all the time assumed that he was an equal partner, and he was not. And in the North Atlantic, the conflicts grew. Doughty was trying to collect supporters, make himself appear to be the central figure of authority on the voyage.
By the time the fleet reaches Port St. Julian on the coast of Argentina, Drake is determined to eliminate Doughty and convenes a trial ashore. The most serious charge is incitement to mutiny. Doughty is eventually found guilty by a majority vote of the jury. The axe falls on the neck of Thomas Doughty.
Drake, being a great leader and a great executor of words, or despite his humble upbringing, did reunite the crew, and one way he did this was a few weeks later, just before entering the Magellan Strait, was to rename the ship the Golden Hind.
Drake's symbolic gesture is meant to stir patriotic sentiment among his crew, for the Golden Hind is the emblem of Sir Christopher Hatton, a royal backer of the voyage. Among the Queen's advisors, Hatton is one of the most passionately anti-Spanish. Drake had also consolidated his fleet, abandoning 2 ships which had been deemed unseaworthy. Only the newly christened Golden Hind, the Elizabeth, and the Marigold continue into the tortuous Straits of Magellan.
And as it turns out, they made it right through without much difficulty. But as soon as they emerged into the Pacific, all hell broke loose.
For 56 days, raging storms batter the fleet, blowing them south along the unforgiving shores of Tierra del Fuego. One ship, the Marigold, is dashed upon the rocks. Only a week later, the Elizabeth becomes separated from the Golden Hind.
The Elizabeth turned tail, ended up finding herself back in the strait, and sailed home to England, leaving only the Golden Hind alone in the Pacific.
With the return of favorable winds, Drake steers the Golden Hind north along the western edge of South America, until now, the exclusive realm of the Spanish crown.
Spanish colonies along the Pacific coast of South America were considered by Spain to be along the shore of their private lake. They had no concerns about anyone coming and raiding them. They had no actual warships of any kind in the area.
Drake and his crew raid Spanish ports and shipping from Chile to Peru. They encounter little resistance while seizing valuable cargoes of silver, trade goods, and wine. Drake frequently takes crew members from Spanish ships, using them as guides in unfamiliar coastal waters. From a seized pilot, Drake hears of a Spanish galleon sailing north to Panama ahead of him. Known as the Cacafuego, it is said to be packed with Spanish treasure. Drake catches up with her off the coast of Ecuador, and after a brief exchange of cannon fire, relieves the Cacafuego of her vast, glittering treasure.
That filled the Golden Hind right up because, well, depending on the estimates that one hears, something around 28 tons of silver.
The largest haul of treasure and plunder that anyone's ever taken up to that point. I mean, that ship alone makes the journey financially.
With the Golden Hind filled to the gunwales, Drake is now faced with a dilemma: how to get home.
He could not go back the way he came because he had just sacked the Spanish and they were looking for him. The only other two options that he thought he had were to sail across the Pacific and around the world to get home, or to sail north through the mythical Northwest Passage, Straits of Anian.
After one last raid on the small port of Huatulco in Mexico, Drake steers due west out into the Pacific, beyond the reach of his Spanish pursuers.
And it's there that the mystery of Drake's movements start. All of Drake's activities along the west coast of South America and in Mexico are very well documented. They're documented because after he'd left, the Spanish sent in their own people to record the testimony of those that Drake had contacted.
From that point on, only those aboard the Golden Hind would know their whereabouts, and their accounts differ dramatically. When we continue, Drake's return to England triggers a massive Elizabethan conspiracy.
Instead of there being great celebrations and huge amounts of publicity, there was complete silence.
After stopping somewhere along the west coast of North America to repair his ship, Drake chooses to return to England the hard way by completing a circumnavigation of the world. He crosses nearly 10,000 miles of open water, rounding the southern tip of Africa, and arrives in Plymouth Harbor in September of 1580, after nearly 3 years at sea.
A long-awaited sight was Rame Head, which is the entrance to Plymouth Sound on the Cornish side, where Drake asked a fisherman, "Does the Queen still live?" He was relieved that there was still the same Queen, Protestant persuasion, on the throne.
The Queen orders Drake to Richmond Palace, where investors learn that the voyage has paid off handsomely. For every English pound risked, Drake has returned 47. Elizabeth would eventually bestow upon Drake the tribute of knighthood.
Drake's knighthood proved that in Tudor times you could rise to the top from starting at the very bottom. And that's what's really written on Drake's coat of arms, from humble beginnings to great achievements. He was an inspiration to the common man to be knighted by the Queen.
But Drake's honor brings with it a bitter mandate. Instead of being allowed to share his achievement with the world, Drake is officially silenced by the Queen.
He'd just carried out the greatest navigational feat in the history of England. And yet, instead of there being great celebrations and huge amounts of publicity, there was complete silence. All of his logs and charts were confiscated by the Queen, locked in the Tower of London, and never seen again, never to this day. His crew was sworn to secrecy under pain of death if they revealed details of their movements.
For nearly 10 years, no account of the voyage is permitted to be published in England. Drake himself is never allowed to publicly document his own version of the events. Why the official cover-up? What did Drake discover on his voyage that was so important to keep secret?
We were very, very concerned about how the events of the voyage were going to affect diplomatic relations with Spain, and they were very fearful of reprisal. So there was a period of great tension.
The most mysterious and debated part of Drake's voyage took place during the summer of 1579, after the Golden Hind left the port of Huatulco, Mexico. Francis Drake steers the Golden Hind on a westerly course into the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean. The course is only to find the northeast trade winds that will take him up the coast of California.
According to the information he had from the Spanish charts or from the Spanish pilots, was that the winds were not right at that time of year for crossing the Pacific.
For 68 days, Drake sails determinedly into the high latitudes of the North Pacific. He risks losing his treasure-laden ship, fighting heavy storms and gale-force winds, all the while seemingly searching for something. Was Drake following secret orders to look for the western end of the Northwest Passage? After all, just a year before Drake set sail, English mariner Martin Frobisher returned from the northeast coast of the New World, claiming to have found the eastern end of the Northwest Passage. The fabled Straits of Anian supposedly joined the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans over the top of North America in a shortcut to the Orient.
Discovery of the Northwest Passage would have been so valuable, of such worth to the English nation, that it's probably the only thing that would have been important enough to justify the secrecy then and the disinformation that was surrounding Drake's voyage.
Like Frobisher in the Atlantic, Drake encounters frigid weather in the North Pacific. So cold, according to written accounts, the crew cannot pull on the ship's ropes.
Drake made it all the way up to 48 degrees north latitude, which puts him in the vicinity of Vancouver Island and the Straits of Juan de Fuca.
With the crew complaining about the cold and the Golden Hind badly in need of repair, Drake eventually turns south looking for land. Cruising down the coast of North America, he soon finds a protected bay where he can haul his ship onto the beach, a process called careening, vital to wooden ships.
They had to all be regularly careened on shore and repaired and refurbished and recorked and have the worm taken out of them.
Realizing the land is inhabited, Drake orders the construction of a defensive barrier, but the natives turn out to be friendly.
At one point, they actually carried out a ceremony in which they appeared to place some kind of crown on Drake's head, and they called him by the same name that they used for their own chief, which was Hio. And so they were probably making Drake an honorary member of the tribe.
Drake claims the land for the Queen, calling it Nova Albion, Latin for New England, because the area's white cliffs remind him of England's White Cliffs of Dover. To mark it as a royal property, Drake posts a brass plaque inscribed with his claim.
This was the very first example of an English protectorate or colony being established on foreign shores, and so it could be argued that this was the birthplace and the first outpost of the British Empire.
After 5 weeks ashore, Drake and his men set course for the Philippines. After one day, they stop at a group of islands to hunt seals and seabirds. It is the last important clue to the whereabouts of Drake's landing. Where exactly did Drake and his men establish Britain's first presence in the New World? The earliest extensive account of Drake's voyage is published in 1589 by the noted marine chronicler Richard Hakluyt, secretary to Lord Walsingham. The pamphlet is included as a short addendum to his earlier book, Principal Navigations. Hakluyt places Drake's summer anchorage at 38 degrees north latitude, putting it on the coast of Northern California just above San Francisco. In 1595 in Amsterdam, Dutch mapmaker Jodocus Hondius publishes a broadside chart of Drake's voyage. A small inset shows the Fair and Good Bay where Drake and his crew landed.
Hondius was an influential cartographer, and he puts some vignettes on his map. One of these is of the so-called Portus, the landing place on the west coast.
Comparison of this image, along with Hakluyt's figure of 38 degrees north latitude, leads most modern historians to believe that Drake's landing site is a very small estuary near Point Reyes, California, now called Drake's Bay. But the final proof seems to come in 1936, when Drake's plate of brass is found nearby, and a respected metallurgist from Columbia University verifies its authenticity.
This plate was accepted as a genuine thing for many years afterwards. In fact, it was considered to be such a wonderful treasure that it was one of the features at the 1939 World's Fair on Treasure Island in San Francisco.
But in 1975, the director of UC Berkeley's Bancroft Library makes arrangements to re-examine the plate. This time, the results are quite different.
The tests made it very obvious that the plate was a fake.
The announcement throws open the doors of speculation. Soon other bays in the neighborhood of 38 degrees are being considered as possible candidates for Drake's Nova Albion. One of the most intriguing sites is Campbell Cove near Bodega Bay in Sonoma County.
Based on the latitude evidence, I focused in on Bodega Harbor and began looking around, and I came out here with the intent of looking to see if I could find a location where Drake would have built a stone fort at the foot of a hill.
Kelleher believes he may have found evidence of Drake's defensive barrier.
And I got out of the car and I looked around and I saw all sorts of rock debris that seemed to be misplaced.
Kelleher contacted state archaeologist Breck Parkman of the California Department of Parks and Recreation. He was impressed enough by Kelleher's evidence to conduct a survey at the site.
Used a technique called a magnetometer, a tool, which is sort of like a fancy metal detector. It picks up magnetic anomalies, including metallic anomalies in the ground. What we did find is that there are areas of the stone fort, the area that Brian has theorized as a stone fort, that do have magnetic and metallic anomalies in the ground.
Could Campbell Cove be Drake's Nova Albion? Proponents also point to its resemblance to the Hondius inset.
The only thing that can settle the controversy is an archaeological finding, and not a single archaeological finding, but a series of them that provide enough unambiguous evidence that people will finally say, yes, this has got to be the location.
While many continue searching the bays and estuaries of California, others are trying to prove that Drake harbored hundreds of miles farther north along the coast of Oregon, and may even have reached as far as Alaska. The official account of Drake's voyage around the world puts Drake's colony of New Albion at 38 degrees north latitude, square in the heart of California. But another account, reportedly based on first-hand information of Drake's voyage, an unsigned manuscript known as the Anonymous Narrative, places the landing at 44 degrees. This pushes Drake's Fair and Good Bay over 500 miles farther north to the rocky coast of Oregon.
I first became involved in the mystery of Drake's movement in 1977. I was living in Canada at the time, and my work brought me in contact with lots of Indian groups, including what was then known as the Nootka tribe on Vancouver Island.
It began with the 200th anniversary of the arrival of another English explorer, Captain James Cook, who explored the west coast of Canada in 1777.
One of their elders, called Moses Smith, said to me, we don't understand all of this fuss about Cook anyway, because we know from our own oral history that there was another white explorer generations before Cook.
Could this other white explorer have been Francis Drake? And could he really have landed as far north as Vancouver? With these questions began an intensive search for clues.
There are different versions of what happened to Drake and how far north he went, and in fact, just how far north he went is a great mystery.
The Anonymous Narrative, a handwritten account that claims to be based on information from 8 members of Drake's crew, seems to support Ward's theory.
The Anonymous Narrative, the document that says that he was at 44 degrees, says that he went up to 48 looking for the straits.
Within this inky scrawl, Ward believes he has found evidence of a cover-up.
But it's clear that the 48 has been altered from another figure. And certainly the first digit used to be a 5, so it was 50-something.
Even on the plates of printed maps, they would make erasures. It was quite common, actually. So I don't think we can read too much into that.
Given that Drake's crew was under orders not to reveal their whereabouts, could this number have been changed to hide the true extent of Drake's northern reach? Also, according to Ward, 16th century maps indicate Drake got much farther north than previously believed. As proof, he cites accurate detailing of islands in the Pacific Northwest on maps published just decades after Drake's voyage. Maps prior to Drake's voyage showed nothing.
And during that period, it was only Drake that was up on this coast.
Some believe that Drake, frustrated by his royally imposed silence, leaked information to mapmakers desperate for knowledge about that area of the world.
If you take all of those cartographic hints together, it suggests that maybe Drake went considerably further north than the Juan de Fuca Strait, and perhaps as far as southeast Alaska.
Other evidence in the accounts also seems to suggest a more northerly course. The extreme cold encountered by the Golden Hind.
They talk about the meat freezing on the way from coming off the fire into the crew's mouths.
Unusual for Californian waters in June, but common at the higher latitudes off the Canadian coast. An analysis of tree rings from the northwest, however, reveals that 1579 was in fact an extremely cold year.
We're talking about a 2,000-year-long chronology that has been worked up for the Sequoia giganticus. That's the giant sequoias up in the High Sierra, and this is the narrowest ring in that entire 2,000-year chronology.
More clues about where Drake spent the summer of 1579 are found in the accounts of the native people he encountered.
They talk about the customs, they talk about ritual, they talk about clothing, hunting, weaponry, housing.
Most experts agree that these descriptions most closely fit the Coast Miwok Indians of Northern California.
Every single thing that is mentioned fits with coastal California Indians.
But Ward finds discrepancies.
For example, the staple diet of the coastal California Indians is the acorn, and yet not a mention of acorns.
Instead, the Indians use roots to make their meals.
And in fact, what he's describing is exactly the kind of roots like camas and what are called Indian potato here that form the staple diet of the Indians of the Oregon coast.
In addition, the Indians' houses are said to be built partially underground. This, Ward contends, more closely matches the huts built by the Salish Indians of the Northwest.
In 1985, when Oregon State University carried out an excavation right here at Whale Cove, they actually found the remains and indications of a semi-subterranean house that is probably of the type described in the Drake accounts.
But it is the physical formation of the land around Whale Cove that is most compelling for Ward. Compared to the Hondius inset of Drake's Harbor, it is a remarkable match, except for one small feature, an island off the small spit of land that forms the harbor.
Although from the Hondius sketch it appears that there is both a spit and an island, in fact, the island is simply a high tide representation of the spit. Once you understand the secret of the Hondius sketch, you'll find the Whale Cove matches it extremely closely.
But what about hard evidence? Are there any traces of Drake's expedition to be found here?
There's a whole history of early English artifacts being found along the Oregon coast.
A number of 16th century coins have turned up, including an English shilling minted in 1560, just 17 years before Drake's voyage. But for now, the question of Drake's presence in Whale Cove will most likely remain open. When we return, Sir Francis Drake dies doing what he loves best, raiding the Spanish Main. When Francis Drake and his crew of the Golden Hind landed on the shores of North America in 1579, They could not have known that locating this site would generate controversy more than 400 years later. Despite the brass plate hoax, most experts still believe that Nova Albion has always been Drake's Estero at Point Reyes.
The geography of Drake's Estero fully matches the accounts. It can't be anywhere else. There's no other place on that Pacific coastline where you could have almost a replica of the White Cliffs of Dover.
But dozens of other bays up and down the west coast, from San Diego to British Columbia, have also claimed to be Drake's Landing. Many compare closely to the known representations.
What we're looking at here is a bottle-shaped bay, and the problem is that the entire west coast of North America is one bottle-shaped bay after another.
But the final clue to the bay's location is found in the written accounts. The islands the Golden Hind visits to hunt seals and seabirds.
They call them the Islands of St. James, and the only thing it corresponds to in Northern California here are the Farallon Islands.
Located approximately 30 miles west of San Francisco, the Farallon Islands are a sanctuary for many of California's endangered species, including sea lions and brown pelicans. If, as the accounts suggest, these islands are a one-day sail from Drake's Harbor, this eliminates many proposed sites. Whale Cove in Oregon is too far. But curiously, it also seems to eliminate the clear favorite, Drake's Estero at Point Reyes. It lies too close to the Farallons.
The Farallon Islands are visible from Drake's Bay. If you get up on the top of the bluffs on a clear day, you can see them. They're a couple hours sail away.
No doubt the search will continue, for wherever Drake landed, he took the first critical step in making England a global power.
This was the beginning of British Empire. There were plans to try to colonize the eastern seaboard before Drake sailed, but now they became more active.
With the voyages of Sir Walter Raleigh in the 1580s and the Mayflower in 1620, England would finally establish a presence on America's east coast. But Drake's colony in the west would not be forgotten.
Drake got to the west coast of America before Raleigh's people got to the east coast, and both of those locations are shown with English flags on the Drake Mellon map, a very important manuscript map.
Drake himself never returns to Nova Albion. Instead, he resumes his obsession with taking revenge on the Spanish West Indies. Places like Cartagena and Santo Domingo, San Juan and St. Augustine curse the name of El Drac, the dragon, for decades to come. His daring assault on the port of Cadiz in Spain is said to singe the king's beard, delaying the launch of Philip's massive invasion force. When the Spanish Armada finally sails for England in 1588, Drake is admiral of the much smaller British fleet that nibbles at its heels from behind.
The world would probably be a different place had Drake not been, for example, involved in the defeat of the Spanish Armada. I don't think that you can find very many people from that period who had the impact on world history that he probably had.
He was the hero, not of the hour, but of the decade. And he had captured more wealth during the Cold War than any other privateer that had lived.
For a while, Drake retires to the country life of a prosperous English gentleman.
He was Deputy Lord Lieutenant for Devon. He had a leak built which brought water to Plymouth for 300 years. He left money to the poor people of Plymouth. He had public buildings and public works built. And as Mayor of Plymouth, he was leading a totally different life to which we associate him with.
But the sea continues to beckon Drake, and in 1595 he attempts another voyage to plunder the Spanish Main. After nearly 40 years of sailing, it would be his last. After setting fire to Nombre de Dios, Drake contracts a bloody dysentery and dies aboard his flagship. Although contrary to the instructions of his will, written just a day earlier, Drake is buried at sea.
He was a man of many faces and great triumphs, and his name still rings down through the ages.